Thank you for joining us for the third CUD Roundtable, this evening focusing on hate speech and freedom of expression. We're delighted that you made the time to come here today on a topic which is, I think, not just topical, but it's been something of a topic that's been crescendo. It's been raising over time in South Africa for many, many decades. I think in the previous dispensation, so in the apartheid period, hate speech was something that was almost actively practiced institutionally. And we went through a period where we tried to cleanse ourselves of institutional hate speech, and now we're getting through a period where it seems some of that is coming back into our institutions, which is a really interesting phenomenon. Quickly, I'd just like to say I'm thrilled to be in this room, because I think it's really intimate and we're all sitting close together, and I'm hoping it's going to inspire a lot of conversation. It's a topic where, ironically, we need to express ourselves. The more that we sit still and don't engage with the topic of freedom of expression and hate speech, the more we give air to those people who would like to abuse it. So this evening I'd really appreciate it if we got into a vigorous debate with each other and a vigorous engagement. We've got a big opportunity in that our speakers are well placed to engage with us, coming from three very different perspectives. Christina Butter is the manager at the Center for Constitutional Rights, and she's going to be speaking to us about the legal perspectives and the legal aspects of the topic. Second up, Ms. Sarah Gom is going to speak to us. She's from the Institute for Race Relations and is a policy fellow there, and will take more of a political perspective. And papers are full, so I'm sure you're going to have your work cut out picking out good examples. And then finally, Professor Nell is going to join us, who is from UNISA. He's a research professor there and a previous president of the Psychological Society of South Africa. And he's going to look at the hate speech topic more from a personal perspective. And I think in many ways that's the one that I think is most intriguing, because it's the one that's often forgotten when we speak about the legal and about the political. Yes, please switch your phones off. It's a good reminder. I think, well, we're going to speak about the examples that we have in recent times, but perhaps the Etzebeth thing is the most happening at the moment, and I think very often we're forgetting the psychological conversation that's happening behind the scenes. The reason why topics like this are pushed very hard in the media is because they're public interest stories, right? Public interest should usually describe things that are important to us from a body politic, but it can also be something which is interesting to you because you're a human, right? So it could be the man-eats-dog phenomenon. It catches interest because it's unusual and because it gets the blood stirring. There's a good word that comes out of the US for this, which is trolling, right? Trolling is when you say things that are intended to annoy your discussant so much that they forget the topic that they're actually discussing. So in some cases, hate speech and freedom of expression is a great way of actually stopping us talking about the things that really matter, which is not to say that this doesn't matter, but it can be a great smokescreen as well. To quickly come back to the Center for Unity and Diversity, who are hosting this event and organizing it, I'd like to say thank you very much for bringing everything together and making sure that we're all here and fed and have our drinks. The Center for Unity and Diversity is focused on inter-community relations and promoting harmony between the various communities. On the one hand, that means recognizing cultural, religious, and linguistic rights, but it's all within the framework of national unity. And I think this is probably something that's going to come out later, is that we have a requirement to express ourselves, but we also have a requirement to not tear down the pillars of the temple that we're trying to build. And it's that responsibility that we're going to try and explore tonight. So that's CUD, and then I'd like to speak briefly about Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Most of the faces in the room are familiar to me already, even though I've not been around for very long. So just quickly again, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation is a German political foundation associated with the German political party, the CDU, Angela Merkel's party. They're center-right, so they take a liberal perspective in terms of an individualistic view of society, but at the same time they draw on faith doctrine to say that values are really important in tempering pure individualistic pursuits. So that is our value perspective on society, and it fits in again to what we say with freedom of expression, on the one hand being critical because it allows us to express our political views and to improve the society that we've inherited, but at the same time also respecting that there's some values that you shouldn't cross because it causes more damage than generating value. Freedom of expression is a thorny topic because it also means different things in different places for different people. And quoting somebody out of context is a great way of making something which is a non-story into a story. An example was recently when the British ambassador to the United States reported confidentially his thoughts on the Trump administration and was then recalled under great pressure by the Trump administration for the confidential information that he shared. So in some cases, your freedom of expression should be respected by the institutional structure that you find yourself within as well. The news from today, I had to laugh, was that President Trump wrote to President Erdogan in Turkey, and he enclosed a confidential letter written to him by the Kurdish general. And so freedom of expression, in some ways I think the more important you are, the less freedom of expression you have, or perhaps should have, right? Because you need to be more careful you're representing a huge perspective. However, it also means sometimes saying things that are very uncomfortable. Things like Brexit was maybe not the wisest idea, and maybe we should rethink it. So anyway, coming back to the topic this evening, I really look forward to our speakers. The structure is going to be that each of our speakers will speak to their individual topic, and then they're going to take a seat in front and have a bit of a Q&A session. And I'd like it to be really, really interactive tonight. I think there's a great opportunity with the three speakers who are eloquent and well-informed for us to come out of this topic better informed than we were before. I know for one that I don't like speaking about this because I'm aware that with my glib humor, I will offend somebody. So I'm hoping this evening I'm going to get some guidance on how to engage with this topic while moving conversation forward. So thank you very much. Christine, I'm going to hand over to you.
Okay, thanks.
This is very cold.
Is it a little bit in your...
Yeah, so I don't know if you want to move around a bit.
Okay, yeah, I might need to. Hi, good evening, everyone. Yeah, I know what you mean. I'm just gonna... Okay, thank you, Megan. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored to speak to you tonight on the topic of freedom of expression versus hate speech. And I would like to thank my co-speakers, Sarah Gon and Professor Joanne Null, who will be sharing their expertise tonight. A bit about myself. I am the manager of the Center for Constitutional Rights, which is also a unit of the F.W. de Klerk Foundation, as is Center for Unity in Diversity. So my background is I'm an attorney by law, I'm an attorney by profession, and I currently focus on doing constitutional research for the foundation. I was specifically asked to speak today because I was extensively involved in a foundation submission, legal submission, that is on prevention and combating of hate crimes and hate speech law. So I'll be sharing the center's view today, and it's a little bit of more constitutional law aspects, or constitutional law view. So please, if it's too technical, just raise your hand and say, listen, just keep it more informal. But I will try not to be. So I think the topic today is highly relevant in our young democracy, especially if we consider recent developments. So we see the state's attempt to criminalize hate speech, or offense of hate speech, and we see disjointed approaches by the courts and the Human Rights Commission on the application or the interpretation of hate speech. So we need to discuss, and I'm very glad Chris has pointed this out, what do we understand in a multicultural society such as ours? What is hate speech? Firstly, what is the state's international obligations regarding hate speech? And is the state curbing hate speech adequately? So this will be my focus tonight. And again, if it's too technical, just let me know. So I think as a starting point, we need to understand the balance between, or a contentious balance between freedom of expression and hate speech. And to understand this, we need to turn to a constitution. So in terms of a constitution, a right to freedom of expression is quite widely described. So it's in terms of section 16.1 or subsection 1 of the constitution. So it provides for freedom of the press and our media, freedom to receive or impart information, artistic creativity, freedom of scientific research. So it's quite wide. And many constitutional court judgments have confirmed that a right to freedom of expression lies at the heart of a democracy. It allows political discourse. It allows us to challenge power and question those in power. It's also a key factor to foster transparency and accountability. that as a society we need to be very cautious, we need to be alert of any state attempts to limit freedom of expression, considering how vulnerable this right is and how important it is for democracy to work. But importantly, like any right and law of rights, or there are certain exceptions, it is not an absolute right. It can be limited, and our constitution provides a very specific limitation test. But what's quite interesting is when it comes to the right to freedom of expression, the right has its own specific limitations. It specifically says in our constitution, okay, these stipulated forms of expressions do not deserve constitutional protection. So it doesn't even trigger a limitation test. If the form of expression falls into one of these categories, it doesn't trigger constitutional protection, end of story. So specifically, the right to freedom of expression in terms of a constitution does not extend to propaganda for war, incitement of imminent violence, and then importantly, advocacy of hatred that is based on race, ethnicity, gender or religion, and that constitutes incitement to cause harm. So our constitution does not use the term hate speech. This last provision, advocacy of hatred, based on these four grounds, such as race, for instance, or gender or religion, which also constitutes incitement to cause harm. That is colloquially known as the hate speech provision in terms of our constitution. So we have a clear constitutional standard of what forms of expression would constitute hate speech and what is not protected. So you have advocacy of hatred, one of the specific grounds, and it must also constitute incitement to cause harm. So again, if a form of expression does not fall into this category, it limits the right to freedom of expression. It falls into constitutionally protected speech, or expression, sorry. And you would need to see if that limitation can be justified. So we have to be very careful when we refer to the term hate speech. Sorry for this constitutional lecture, but I think it's an important point to grasp, especially if you consider now current measures of curbing hate speech and to understand actually our current dilemma. Now, recognition of a right to freedom of expression and expressions which do not deserve protection in terms of the Constitution is specifically aligned with international law obligations. So we did not go and reinvent any wheel. We're specifically bound by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights to uphold, known as the ICCPR, to uphold civil and political rights. So our constitutional right to freedom of expression and expression not deserving protection echoes Article 19 and 20 of the ICCPR. So if I can just quickly read it, Article 20 of the ICCPR obliges state parties to prohibit by law any propaganda of war and any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that also constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. So again, we see it mirrors exactly our constitutional standard of hate speech. And interesting enough, the ICCPR doesn't require state parties to regulate hate speech by means of criminal statutory penalties. It only requires us to regulate it by legislation. And this is quite an important point. And as a matter of fact, there's very clear guidance from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on how to interpret Article 20 of the ICCPR, meaning how to interpret how should state parties, when they're drafting legislation, curbing hate speech, what should they take into account? Now, firstly, this guidance, international guidance, is found in the form of a rubber plan of action. It specifically says any legislation curbing hate speech must have a high threshold, it must be proportional, it must be narrowly defined, it must respond to a pressing societal need, it must contain robust definitions for key elements such as hatred, discrimination, violence, and hostility. So if we turn back to our situation, if we look at those international law obligations and guidance we have on the interpretation of hate speech, how are we doing? Now, as a start, we have the Equality Act. The Equality Act is known as the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act. Shortly, it's known as the Equality Act. The Equality Act is a go-to act regarding hate speech. It's in terms of which complaints are made in hate speech. So we never just put it practical. You always turn to your domestic, your subordinate legislation before looking at the Constitution. So the Equality Act specifically prohibits hate speech and regulates hate speech. So it should be, it's in line with the ICCPR's obligations. The problem, however, is the prohibition of hate speech in terms of the Equality Act is not in line with the constitutional standard of hate speech. So technically, in terms of the Equality Act, we are not dealing with hate speech as understood in terms of the Constitution. In my view, this is problematic, and it has created confusion on application by the courts and the Human Rights Commission. So the Equality Act essentially provides, I'm just going to quickly read it, no person may publish, propagate, advocate, or communicate words based on one or more prohibited grounds. So their grounds extend to also it's many more grounds than 4 limited grounds, for instance, language, age, etc. And against any person that could be construed to demonstrate a clear intention to be hurtful, harmful, incite harm, or to promote or propagate hatred. So I know it's a lot of terminology, but breaking it up again, our prohibited grounds in terms of the Constitution have been extended. These could probably be still justified in terms of the Constitution. But critically, a Constitution requires advocacy of hatred, which constitutes incitement to harm. These two criteria, which is in line with international law. We do not see this reflected in terms of the Equality Act. There's no need to show that there's been advocacy of hatred. So if you look at international law, it specifically means publicly calling, and it's important, it's publicly calling for an audience to act based on hatred, it's an intense emotion of loathing due to a characteristic such as a person's sexual orientation. And then secondly, to show it constitutes incitement to harm, meaning again, that harm to that specific group doesn't necessarily have to happen, but there needs to be a risk, a foreseeable risk, and that's why you want to regulate hate speech, to ensure that risk does not actually happen. So, as you can see, there is different standards, and the definition of hate speech is much broader in terms of the Equality Act. And as in fact, we're actually dealing here probably with constitutionally protected expression. Now, our hate speech prohibition in terms of the Equality Act is currently facing a constitutional challenge. And I know Professor now is actually, not specifically to a constitutional challenge, but he has specifically been involved in a Kolani versus South African Human Rights Commission matter. It's homophobic statements made by him, and it's been dragging for years, this matter. Now, besides, we don't even need to go into a merits of the case. There's been horrific statements. I think it's, in my opinion, very personal opinion, I think it's been grounds for hate speech, even if you compare it to constitutional standards. But importantly, he's brought a constitutional challenge to Section 10 of the Equality Act, prohibition of hate speech. And I do think it has been long coming. We've had many articles writing on this aspect. It's unfortunate that specifically in his case being brought up, but the Supreme Court of Appeal would need to deal with it soon. The Pretoria High Court, which entertained the matter, dismissed the constitutional challenge, and in my view, they did not adequately actually deal with it. So you have, your prohibition is much broader than your hate speech prohibition in terms of the Constitution. And I didn't actually say, well, is this limitation to freedom of expression justified, considering a limitation test in the Constitution? So I'm looking forward to see how the SCA specifically handles this matter. Now, the contrast again between our constitutional understanding of hate speech and the Equality Act's prohibition of hate speech has also caused friction on how courts actually interpret hate speech. If we look at the SCA matter of Adenauer versus South African Human Rights Commission, so some of you might have heard about it. It was statements made by a member of CUD targeting the Jewish community. So the matter was on appeal in the Supreme Court of Appeal in December. Now, interesting enough, the SCA didn't apply, they took offensive words and they measured it directly against the constitutional prohibition of hate speech or constitutional standard, and they found the words not to amount to hate speech. Whereas the High Court applied the Equality Act and found it to be hate speech. Now, this is again my opinion. I think you can criticize the Supreme Court on the fact that the complaint papers were pleaded in terms of the Equality Act. Complaint was never an issue of constitutional issue. They applied by themselves the constitutional prohibition. Now, SCA interesting enough said there's cause for concern and provisions of Section 10 of the Equality Act, prohibition of hate speech, have the effect of condemning hate speech that is protected under Section 16 of the Constitution. So the matter is currently on appeal at the Constitutional Court and has recently been argued, and we are awaiting judgment. But it definitely shows there's friction between an Equality Act and a Constitution, and there's a need for an Equality Act to be aligned with the Constitution. There's an absolute need for standards to be built and guidance to be provided in our Equality Act on how we deal with hate speech. In my opinion, a lack of guidance on the Equality Act and a lack of reference to international standards has also been problematic when we look at Human Rights Commission's manner of handling complaints of hate speech. If we take, for instance, reports and statements made by Mr. Malema, specifically in November 2016, where he said, he specifically said, we are not calling for the slaughtering of white people, at least for now. We are calling for a peaceful occupation of land. Okay, this is just a quote from a long speech he made outside court in November 2016. The Human Rights Commission was asked by various organizations to investigate the matter. They found it not, in terms of the Equality Act, not to amount to hate speech. So the Human Rights Commission, they took into account historical context, social context, and factual context. But interesting enough, in my opinion, it didn't take into account, firstly, the standing of Mr. Malema. He's a leader of one of the biggest political parties. The size of the audience, the reach of the audience, the intensity, the form and content of the speech. The fact that it was made to a large audience, perhaps, but it has the effect to generate, to multiply. These are all factors that should have been taken into account in terms of international law. So again, it's a disjointed approach we see. So lastly, as I said earlier, we are also facing a state's attempts to criminalize for the offense of hate speech. So quickly, in terms of common law, it is possible to, there's a common law crime of criminal injuria, but what the state is attempting to do in terms of prevention and combating of hate crimes and hate speech bill is to provide for statutory offense of hate speech and hate crimes. So from the outset, and I'm very glad, I think Professor Now will go in a lot of detail on hate crimes, I would like to say the Centre was in favour of a bill's attempt to distinguish hate crimes from ordinary crimes. He will go in a lot of detail why, but just in very specific, it's a very specific type of crime. And by distinguishing it from ordinary crimes, you will have specific reporting on the crime, you have data collection on the crime, and you'll be able to tackle a specific crime and prosecute it effectively. So hate crimes, there's always been, in my opinion, a need to distinguish it. It is, and it's unfortunate that it's been looped in offence of hate speech, and what we see now, this bill has been introduced in 2016 already. 2019, the bill lapsed in May 2019, and we're still not seeing the offence of hate crimes being recognised because the offence of hate speech is so problematic. So it was a draft bill, like I said, was introduced by the department in 2016, and firstly, it was not in any way how our constitutional standard of hate speech. It in fact criminalised various forms of expression which is constitutionally protected, and we had to ask, is this, considering a drastic limitation on freedom of expression, is it justified? And we said it wasn't a reasonable justification because of a low threshold. They were looking at, in effect, criminalizing, ridiculing, or bringing into contempt a person or group of people. So it caused a great outcry, and it was back to the drawing boards for the department. And in 2018, an updated version was formally tabled in Parliament, and a whole public submission round was sought again. So the updated version of the offence of hate speech was far better than the previous version, but in our analysis, it was still not constitutionally aligned. Again, it did not relate to hate speech in terms of our constitution. We had to again say, considering a drastic limitation on freedom of expression, considering you're actually looking here at an imprisonment of 3 years on a first conviction, can it be justified? Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of time to go into a whole analysis, but what was quite interesting is the offence of hate speech in a bill is to a large extent replicated actually the Equality Act's prohibition. Again, it's problematic as it's not constitutionally aligned, but what's even more problematic is no definitions were provided for key elements of the offence. And it begs the question, how will the public actually know, well, this is a criminal offence, how will we be able to distinguish the same expression prohibited in terms of the Equality Act? And again, if we look at international law guidance, it's very clear in terms of a rubber plan of action, as is gave a little bit of detail before. criminal sanctions to curb hate speech should be seen as an absolute last resort. They actually said, well, if you're going to provide for criminal sanctions, you need to build on a proper threshold test. There needs to be consideration to a context, a standing of a speaker, a form of speech. You need to see if it's provocative, it's direct. Look at the reach and the size of the audience. None of these guiding factors were even considered or as giving any guidance in a bill. So there's no, how will this actually be applied? It's one of the biggest questions. So we believe it's still not constitutionally aligned. So at the end of the day, we have legislative measures to curb hate speech. We have the Equality Act. It's far from perfect. I believe the Equality Act's prohibition of hate speech specifically should be firstly aligned with the Constitution. There should be very clear guidance on its interpretation in line with international law guidance. Educate people on the Equality Act, on the Equality Court's application, how it would work. I think there's also a big gap in that regard. And penalties should also reflect how severe the matter is. That should be proper research should be done. This does not close the door to act on offensive statement or different intolerances, but it cannot simply be looped on a banner of hate speech. And it's at a risk of our right to freedom of expression, which is always vulnerable in a democracy. I also do not believe we have yet, or the state has yet shown, that criminal sanctions are the only means to curb hate speech. I strongly believe it should be an absolute last resort, but if the state is able to show there's a real pressing societal need on evidence, it's constitutionally aligned, you brought a proper threshold, then it could at least be considered. You could properly analyze it. We are, however, very, very far away from that being presented. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Our next speaker will be Professor Adenauer, and looking forward to you.
Thank you very much. So important to note is that I'm a psychologist by profession, and I'll focus therefore less on the law, and I'll focus more on painting a picture of the psychology of hate, and for that matter the intersection between psychology and the law, informed by my own work in this field and work done specifically under the auspices of the Hate Crimes Working Group, as well as the Psychological Society of South Africa. The National Hate Crimes Working Group is a national network of CSOs that are focused on a range of sectors that are vulnerable to hate victimization, as will become apparent, and SAHRC being the oldest, largest, nationally representative psychological society in Africa, for that matter. I've got 4 primary take-home messages, and in this regard, firstly, I'll be focusing on the Hate Crimes Working Group research results towards hopefully motivating to you as the audience also why it's important that we have hate crime provision in the law. And then a bit lower down you'll see the John Quelani Equality Court case matter appearing, and indeed that will be my second focus. And I think important then as a first take-home is that psychology led the most comprehensive in-depth study of hate incidents in South Africa to date, and accordingly we have an evidence base regarding the occurrence, nature and impact, but definitely not the prevalence of hate incidents at our disposal for legislators and policymakers to be used. Certainly, we have confirmation that hate incidents have a especially traumatic effect on victims, with additional consequences for communities and society, as I'll demonstrate. What we know is that some are targeted more than others, but all in South Africa are affected by hate, and indeed there's limited recourse. There's a skewness in terms of those whose experiences are given more attention. There's definitely been a politicization of hate, so which hate and which victimizations count is certainly a question. While not a proponent of the criminalization of hate speech, given that other remedies exist, I hope to illustrate that words do matter and can be hurtful and harmful. Indeed, the Hate Crimes Working Group and SAHRC are of the opinion that the inclusion of hate speech in the Prevention and Combating of Hate Crimes and Hate Speech Bill presents a major challenge, will most probably be constitutionally challenged, and indeed, as we've already seen, will delay the passing of a much needed protection for victims of hate crime. And I'll hope to illustrate a bit of that with the Kolani case. And then overall point that I hope will come from my presentation is that indeed all, including psychology, have a role to play in a meaningful response to what we deem is a social problem requiring social solutions. So the first area of focus is reflecting on a unique 5-year longitudinal study by the Hate Crimes Working Group. It's the first of its kind. The process started with the formation of the Hate Crimes Working Group in 2009, 2010. It concluded in 2017. And I'm sharing this towards painting that picture of hate incidents in South Africa and hopefully demonstrating the role that hate speech specifically plays within that context. What is important to note is that we have a paucity of empirical data on the prevalence, nature, and impact of hate incidents in South Africa. Historically, there's been no monitoring of hate incidents. And indeed, we know that there's no legislation regarding hate crimes in South Africa. So when we started this process, there was a need for an evidence base towards informing the drafting process. Therefore, the legislative importance of what we've done, what we've been doing should be apparent, together with the social and societal importance. As then Minister Jeff Radebe said, we needed to send a clear message around hate crime and that it would not be tolerated. And of course, we know that the law is also access to resources regarding raising awareness and the training of service providers. But as far as the social importance, internationally we know that hate victimization is considered priority crimes, and I'm talking specifically about hate crime, based on the severity of the emotional and psychological impact. And we know that indeed it impacts beyond the individual victim, also to affecting communities and then extending to society. And just to briefly illustrate that, when it comes to communities, we know that hate incidents curb visibility and expression of certain groups. It intimidates and disrupts entire communities. Those who share the characteristics or the identity of the targeted individual organization become fearful. When it comes to the society, we know that the New York State Hate Crimes Act describes hate crimes as anti-democracy, anti-an open society, and they make it clear that it tears at the very fabric of a free society. So indeed, we need to make the plight of victims, we need to take the plight of victims seriously. What data did we collect? Certainly, the definition for hate incidents that we used was a reflection of hate crime, hate speech, and intentional unfair discrimination as provided in definitions at that time, provided by the Foundation for Human Rights and the Department of Justice in the draft policy at the time. And I won't reflect on the methodology of the study, and I won't reflect on the considerable challenges, but indeed we documented 945 cases over 5 provinces, and we gauged a range of information as reflected on this slide. We have a picture of who the victims of these hate incidents were, and indeed the point could be made that no one's exempt, but some vulnerable groups are targeted more, or at the very least we become more aware of those because the cases are recorded more. It could be due to greater reporting in the media. It could also be through the participating organizations in this research, but certainly we have a sense that nationality, and that would be xenophobic attacks, was the most pronounced in our research. If you look at the second and the fourth bullets, sexual orientation and gender identity and expression, also known as SOGI, if you count those two together, it ends up at 28%. The third one there is religion. From our perspective, we think this is a relatively accurate reflection of vulnerabilities in our society, and it accords with anecdotal evidence, media reports, and the concerns raised by CSOs in the field. If you look at race at 9%, this could be an underrepresentation or not. And why I say perhaps not is because in the democratic South Africa we know that race has been the one area that's been primarily forwarded as an area of concern and intervention, and certainly you know you're in the wrong if you transgress at that level. But interesting, of course, with the Penny Sparrow case, there was an avalanche of race-based hate speech cases that followed from that. Important on this slide would be where the perception of the prejudice would be based on, and it was in the specific words or the rhetoric that accompanied these cases. Indeed, in 68% of the cases, people were very clear, the victims always knowing that it was a hate incident in accordance to them. As far as the hate incidents are concerned, this is perhaps an interesting slide just to offset what the media representation might be. If you look at the, I don't know if this is a pointer as well, but yeah, I think it is. No, it's not. If you look at the murder, rape, sexual assault cases, you'll see that those are certainly fewer and further in between. The majority of cases are somewhat what is quite ordinary and everyday occurrences in South Africa, robbery and theft and damage to property, assault and the likes. But more importantly for the purpose of this presentation is looking at the other incidents. If you look at intimidation, hate speech, harassment, intentional unfair discrimination, and how pronounced that was in our research, these are the ongoing, sustained, everyday occurrences that seldom, if ever, would make headlines in the newspaper. But collectively, we believe that they create a breeding ground for hate crime victimization. And what was interesting from the research is that often these incidents occurred on public transport, so minibuses, trains and the likes, or while walking home. And very often was the proverbial standing out like a sore thumb of someone with a different skin tone, some with a different accent, non-conforming gender expressions and the likes. So as far as perpetrator characteristics are concerned, the only point I'm going to highlight is that is in red. If you look at how often the victim is known, the perpetrator is known to the victim, how often it would be community members, it does give you a sense of where interventions and remedies ought to be, and that indeed restorative measures might be called for. The impact on the victim. Of course, the individual impact would be at the forefront of our mind, but I've already indicated the societal and community impact, and I just want to highlight that a little bit more by saying that indeed security and trust is lost at a societal level, and fear and anger spreads. And the best example would be non-national based victimization, and I see the Congolese network are represented. It's a member of the hate crimes working group. Isaiah, welcome. So certainly at a societal level we have a sense in South Africa of what happens. At a family or community level, debilitated individuals also constitute debilitated families. If someone loses the ability to meaningfully contribute to their family, community or society. As much as love is meant to begin at home, so hate does too from our evidence. Very often the family members or community members were perpetrators. At an individual level, we know that the impact is cumulative, lasting, and debilitating. And it's indeed primarily emotional, but there's mental effects, physical effects, emotional harm, and relationships that are affected. And that our report that you can download from the web, and I've got a few copies on page 15, explains more of this. But it's also because it's an identity crime. It's because of who you are, because it's often repeated. It often occurs in context of structural inequality and systemic neglect and or discrimination. And what we know from the literature is that discrimination and human rights violations constitute a lack of psychological well-being. I'm not going to say much about the observed changes, but I've already mentioned physical, relationship, and living conditions. And if you look at what's on the slide, what is interesting is that for different target groups, there's different impacts that are pronounced. And if you look at the living conditions one, that's what a lot of the non-national victims of hate told us. Another slide just to give you an indication of if I say that the greatest impact that we saw was at an emotional level, and for that matter, mental effects. And I've just highlighted a few. But if you think around people ending up feeling like a freak, dehumanized, ashamed, fearful, they've lost their dignity, if they feel bullied, stigmatized like an outsider and shunned, or less than a criminal in a democratic dispensation where we know that criminals have a lot of rights. The mental effects that I'm just going to highlight is risky behavior, self-destructive behavior, substance abuse, suicidality, self-blame, disturbed, unstable, felt like they're losing their minds. If I mention these things, what is important to note is that there's a whole body of literature around internalized stigma, internalized depression, and I'm not sure what happened there. I don't think it was on my side. Okay. And for that matter, minority stress. So if people end up feeling devaluated, third-class citizens, if they personally feel to blame for what happened to them, all of this was relevant in the Equality Court matter in which SAHRC was an amicus, and that I'll present to you just now. Some of the findings that we had around the response to hate incidents in South Africa, of course we know that civil society, Chapter 9s and statutory bodies are very much at the forefront, but I would say good efforts within their abilities and mandates, but clearly overwhelmed. And what's important for me as a psychologist is that NGOs in this country, as much as they try their best to support within their court business, their work is very often within the legal assistance and perhaps paralegal. At most, there's a support group kind of a service that they render. Very few cases that we documented spoke around psychosocial support beyond initial trauma counseling. And in fact, very seldom was there any services beyond a lay counseling service. And this is an important point if you think around resilience building, preventative work that is needed. The criminal justice, I'm not going to say much, but the attrition that you can see there in terms of prosecution mirrors what we see in general in South Africa. And indeed, it does not bode well for criminalization of hate speech over and above all the rest. We know that there's been task teams, such as the National Task Team addressing homophobia and transphobia. There's been the National Action Plan to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. And there's the proposed legislation. Let's then look at the second area that I just want to focus on a little bit, and this is really towards illustrating that words do matter and can be hurtful and harmful. And certainly if you consider the unprecedented number of complaints to the Human Rights Commission and the Press Ombudsman around the Kwelani hate speech case. This is an incident that happened in 2008. The court proceedings started in 2012. It continued until 2017 and it's ongoing. And then I suppose if you consider the political will and the rapid turning of the wheels of justice and the Penny Sparrow, the Vicky Momberg and other race-based cases, one wonders about this incident that was an equality and a constitutional challenge. And I'm not going to go into the details of the case, hoping that you're familiar with it or that you'll consult the case material. But in this matter, SAHRC presented evidence and made submissions regarding the important purpose served by Section 10.1 of the Equality Act to stem systemic verbal and physical violence based on prohibited grounds of discrimination in the Act. Research-based evidence was brought to the court of the harmful psychological effects and the consequences of hate speech on members of the LGBTI community and on the broader society, very much like I've already even indicated to you. And more specifically, there were 4 things that we brought to the attention of the court. We located the provisions of Section 10.1 of the Equality Act within its proper psychological, social, scientific and constitutional context, and thus demonstrated that hate speech causes deep psychological harm to its targets. Secondly, that the associated limits on the right to freedom of expression is reasonable and justifiable, and that there should be a balancing between the right to the freedom of expression against constitutional protection for equality and dignity of all persons, regardless of their status and or identity. And remember, we're not talking about the criminalization of hate speech within the Equality Act. Thirdly, we brought to the court's attention that the Act is concerned with remedying the pernicious effect of discrimination on the victims of that discrimination and society generally, and that's really important. And it does so by providing a range of innovative and flexible, well, theoretically, flexible civil remedies. And then fourthly, we highlighted the damaging effects of discriminatory speech contained in Kwelani's article on members of the LGBTQI community in particular and on society at large. And certainly the nature and the effect of the material harm and the tangible consequences on its targets and society at large were indeed emphasized. So the slogan that some of the supporters of the case wore to the court was that no freedom with hate. And indeed, the point to be made is that the right to free speech should not ignore the pain of hurt caused by such by hateful speech. If you look at the detail of this case, August 2017, the court finds Kwelani's article amounts to hate speech and to be hurtful and harmful and propagating hatred towards the LGBTI community, and it dismisses the constitutional challenge. Already in September of that same year, Kwelani brings an application for a leave to appeal the judgment. And then indeed, in August 2019, the Supreme Court of Appeal hearing happened. And certainly we expect that this is going to end up in the Constitutional Court as well. And the question, I suppose, that I'm wanting to ask here is to what extent this case potentially indicates a travesty of justice. If you look at those recent cases of hate speech that were dealt with very swiftly by the courts, and I would say rightfully so. Here we had an absolute failure of the courts to send a strong message and to condemn the hateful, harmful insults. And the question is it acceptable then to dehumanize gays and lesbians and liken them to animals, as was the case here? Or the question could be asked whether the trial process that ventilated the issues in and of itself constitutes a success. We can't generalize from our own experience, but the proceedings were utterly frustrating, extremely resource intensive. It required inordinate expertise to negotiate all the barriers that we encountered. And certainly the Hate Crimes Working Group and SAHRC for that matter are strongly in support for the need to amend PAPUDA or the Equality Act. And this was in fact promised in October of 2016 by the then Minister of Justice, Mike Masuta. And I do think we should keep the Minister to account in that regard. I'm moving towards conclusion by just saying that, of course, there's a whole range of continued efforts that are required at the legislative, advocacy and intervention level. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to reflect on all of that, but certainly we need to interrupt institutionalized prejudice, and we need to increase support for vulnerable communities. We need to raise more awareness, and we need to create more opportunities for hate victimization conversations and recourse, and the interventions ought to be more proactive. So I'm concluding with just a thank you and my contact details, and indeed also the Hate Crimes Working Group website, where you'd be able to download the reports. I've got about 5 copies of it, but certainly it is available for download.
Sorry, my computer's here in lieu of written notes. But since some of the ground I was going to cover has been covered, I'll be a little bit more sort of, forgive me if I'm a bit sort of here and there and wherever. I'm Sarah Gon, I'm from the Institute of Race Relations, the slayer of official oppositions, according to all that we know. Unintentionally, I have to say. But we are a classical liberal think tank. That is our function, is to promote freedom. That is, everything has to fall within that space. And being such a think tank, we don't have a uniform view on whether hate speech should be legislated or not, or even appear in the Constitution. Some feel that hate speech is speech. You've got to deal with it, and you've got to deal with it in a whole lot of other ways, and legislation is not the way to go. Others feel that at least they can live with the constitutional limitation, but in words of one syllable, we don't like the Equity Act. And I'll go on to say why. And the interesting thing about talking at this point is hearing my predecessors, because I'm going to steal a little bit from what they've said to put forward what generally I think is probably the dominant, our predominant view, and that is that when we don't generally believe that legislating against hate speech is helpful. And I largely say that because because so much depends on your political environment as to whether hate speech is dealt with properly, in the legal sense, or abused, or not used at all. And it doesn't take into account proclivities which can easily be reflected positively or negatively by your political leadership. And you'll see what I mean when I go through. I'm personally very strongly of the view that the society you have, particularly from a point of tolerance, depends entirely on the extent to which your leadership leads against hate and intolerance. And I do not think our leadership has acted attractively. And I think in particular, it's not confined, but I think we really saw an uptick in about 2015 when Jacob Zuma gave his State of the Nation address. Because then you started to see regular use of white monopoly capitalists or capital. And it sort of picked up from there, and it came into the political, those sorts of statements, and it wasn't necessarily only against whites, but that sort of intolerance became very much part of the discourse. And people are entitled, if I can put it that way, to take their cue from their leadership. If our presidents, the past two presidents in particular, and probably the one before that, had said the Constitution aims for equality, the Constitution provides that hate is unacceptable, some ways of putting it, and kept pushing for an equal society in terms of how we respect each other and how we deal with each other, that would be more and more reflected in the population, because you take your lead from your leadership. But it hasn't. It became intolerance has become a scapegoat for poor political performance and worse, and we all know what we mean by that. So, I mean, if you look at it, probably the extreme, although it allowed extreme legislation to go through, is the Nazi era. I mean, no amount of any legal right helped, and gradually the legal rights were supplanted by inhuman rights, or inhumanity, can I put it that way, and that Jews were specifically targeted for not being allowed to do certain things, for not being allowed to practice their occupations. And society didn't do anything about it. And that's what I say, your leadership is your lodestar in that respect. And we've obviously got a history where we're vulnerable to picking and choosing victims. And on the one hand, obviously in many respects whites are fair game, both justifiably and unjustifiably. And in reference to the LGBTQI fraternity, a lot of it has a conservative base in belief and attitude, and it's very difficult to get beyond that, even with legislation. It's such a embedded issue, and we believe largely that even expressing hatred at least gets the issues aired. It gets the issues aired, and in a society, in a free society, in a democratic society where the media and the social media are just there, out there, the issues can be dealt with and can be argued nicely or not so nicely, cogently or not so cogently, but they are discussed. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be ways of trying to deal with the matter. I would agree with the professor completely, but law does worry me. And I'd like to use the Penny Sparrow case as the particular example for the political abuse of legislation. And I'm not going to go into detail, but we all know what happened. And basically, in January 2016, this rather unfortunate human being posted on Facebook, put a post on Facebook in which she likened black people to monkeys and connected it to leaving a beach littered. Now, no decent human being I know read that or heard about it without cringing to the core of their being. And social media went into action. Now, the ANC and the Human Rights Commission applied for her to be dealt with by the Equality Court. And the Equality Court found that she was guilty of hate speech. Again, I believe that she was guilty of racism, probably crass stupidity, carelessness, and probably being sort of more closer to my age than the youth of the country, not entirely au fait with the possible consequences of social media. And that is, if you communicate to 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 people you know, we are in an era where it's not going to stay there. However it's dealt with, it is not going to stay there. And so she ended up before the Equality Court, the end result of which was that she was found guilty of committing hate speech, and she was required to pay 150,000 rands damages to the Oliver and Adelaide Tambo Foundation, which promotes tolerance, non-racialism, and social and economic upliftment. Now, for me, what was terrifying about the way the Equality Court dealt with it is I think they just took the politics and ran with it. And they did it for this reason. She made the statement in January 2016. She was through the Equality Court by June of 2016. I'm a lawyer. I don't practice anymore, but I practiced for a long time. I have never seen anything go from beginning to end that quickly in any court, in any form of offence. It doesn't matter how heinous. But if your ANC and the SAHRC are leading the charge, you have to have a very strong magistrate who's going to not buckle. I don't know if buckle's the word. And see, I think the problem is what also came out of the hate speech case was the decision. I struggle to be convinced that she met the requirements of hate in the sense of inciting people, because you need an element of intention to incite, and she made people unbelievably angry and upset. That's not even debatable. But I do not believe that she was either intended to incite, nor that anyone can really argue that, except perhaps in a handful of situations, that the vast majority of people who were offended by it would have risen up and done something violent or be tempted to attack anybody. I think most people, however they saw it, seriously, not very seriously or not, it was hurtful, and there's no doubt that has its own impact on individuals. But to stretch it to the point of hate speech, meaning that she incited, I don't see it. Was her speech understood by its audience as a call to acts of discrimination, violence, or hostility? Now, the vast audience that would have picked this up would have been offended that it in itself was discriminatory and even hostile. but violent, no. And worse than that is, the question is, was she, Penny Sparrow, able to influence the audience? And I don't believe she was able to influence, not to the extent of incitement. And in that respect, both for the political intensity of the matter and for the fact of who said it and where it came from and what the circumstances that it was being said at, that's where I believe legislation on hate speech runs the risk, and I'll come to it. I've mentioned the fact that the applicants were ANC and SAHRC, so that's very heavy political weight. It was done and dusted in 6 months. Her criminal trial for criminal defamation, criminal injuria, was done and dusted 3 months later, 9 months, all of which is unbelievably speedy, which makes me suspicious. Her application for leave to appeal, which was made at the end of November 2016, was turned down. The argument was that she had not stipulated an address for documents to be served and lodged her application in the Magistrates' Court, not in the High Court. And she was ordered to pay costs. Now, whatever one thinks of Penny Sparrow, you know, indigence by the time she got to court was an issue. She could not afford proper legal representation, and it was a very unforgiving response to that application. I mean, obviously she would have been in a position to petition the Supreme Court of Appeals for an appeal, but she shouldn't have had to. And I think that very, very aggressive attitude to the application for leave to appeal was, in its own way, racist. It was politically motivated. It was very unfair. I mean, if you think of the fact that Jacob Zuma has been able to go all the way to 10 years without seeing the inside of a proper trial on the basis of being granted leave to appeal, probably there's a political element there too. This was outrageous. And I mean, just another little thing that occurred at the beginning of the trial. Sorry, I'm just trying to find it. Oh, the very first appearance she didn't appear. Her daughter came on her behalf and asked for a postponement. And they said no. Now, she should have appeared, but again, she hasn't got the money for lawyers. She doesn't necessarily know that she can't send her daughter to represent her. And this is a court that is meant to try and almost mediate a solution between the parties. It was so loaded against her. Look, an appeal wouldn't have helped because she died before an appeal was at all possible. It's the heavyweights in South Africa came down on her like a ton of bricks. Now, a little thing that worries me as well is that Vicky Momberg, who is a much less sympathetic character, she was also ordered to pay 150,000 rand fine. But she was given jail time, which is unheard of for a crime of this nature. And both of them were going. The fine they were paid was going to be given to the Oliver and Adelaide Tambo Foundation. In the case of Adam Katsavelos, who is a fairly unsympathetic character himself, his fine of the same amount, which is I think the maximum, was to be given to an organisation that was commemorated as a hero of 1976. For me, the question is why those organisations? Why repeatedly in the case of the Tambo Foundation? It's in the terrain of political, and yet that balancing and trying to mediate didn't take place. So the court has been playing a sort of a very, very mixed role. Somewhere along the line, someone said, but she must have understood what would happen when she said what she said. I'm not convinced that that is unarguable. I think that it is arguable that she didn't foresee it. If she were 20 years old, she'd have foreseen it. But a woman in her 60s, or late 50s, may not well have foreseen it. I believe that society is capable of taking people like Penny Sparrow to task. And given social media and media, that is exactly what happened to her. By the time she got to court, never mind got to a decision in court, she'd lost her job, she'd lost her income, she'd lost her house, she was absolutely indigent. Society had passed judgment on her and it had had severe results. But on top of that then happened the 2 court cases. And for me, the court, after the society had essentially rendered its verdict and its penalty, it effectively became a legal lynch mob after that. The other problem with this sort of targeting is it was quick. Right-wing white opinion is likely to have been defensive and angry about it. So the purported ideal in the Equity Act of fostering unity and diminishing discrimination, I think it had the opposite effect. I don't think it did any of those things. It upped the ante for everybody because it gave the social media was clearly people on it saw themselves as empowered, which they were, and I think the excess with which she was seen to be dealt with was seen on the right to be completely unfair, that no one was going to ever get a proper hearing, and there were different standards for different people. And having come from a history of that, the issue is there should not be different standards for different people. They do have to be judged on their merit, but the merits perhaps not, let's say, warranted. Another problem with the Human Rights Commission, other than the fact that it went and pronounced almost a judgment on a very popular rugby player playing in the World Cup rugby, is that in, I think it was March of this year, the Human Rights Commission said that basically its responses to who the perpetrator was and how serious what they had done would be to some extent dictated to by which group they came from and whether it had been a previously disadvantaged group or not. And hence you get Julius Malema's getting away with the statement he got away with, which is absolutely outrageous because the power relations have changed completely, and power relations are important, and they really go back to my original point on the leadership and he is part of the leadership and the effect that leadership does or doesn't have on the matter. In essence, I agree with the professor entirely on advocacy and intervention, but I'm not convinced about legislation because legislation does not change minds. It usually just makes one side very victorious and the other side very angry and very pissed off. So I don't think it changes mind. But more important than that, and this is where my anger at the political leadership comes in, is we've done surveys over the last 3 years, general social economic surveys that cover a very wide ground, levels of unemployment, where people are employed, how they're employed, etc. And we've asked the question, what are for you the issues that the government must deal with? 2015, 2016, 2017, we're working on the report for 2018. Jobs is always number one. Always, unchangingly is number one. Number two can be fighting corruption 1 year, service delivery another year, crime another. That sort of changes depending on what's happened in the last year. Now, there are usually at least 10 categories. It sometimes go to 14. The bottom category is land reform, and the second penultimate issue is racism. Now, a lot of people like our research until they get to the bottom, because it doesn't accord with what people think. We think that the leadership, deliberately or otherwise, is out of touch with what people think about and what they're concerned about. That their responses to the crisis in their lives is commonsensical. And while racism is certainly, without a doubt, and xenophobia are a problem, even notwithstanding the years of Momberg and Katsavelos and Sparrow, they still rank at the bottom. That is not everybody's daily lived experience. And I'm obviously talking broadly. It is looked at across areas. It doesn't deal with the specifics, for example, of LGBTQI hatred, but it just talks about, we just deal with racism in general. And so, and also the other thing, and this is probably my last point, is that we tend to forget that the media and the social media, are loud as they are still a very small reflection of the population of this country. So we don't necessarily know what people are thinking on a broad scale. It is, to some extent, it's an elite situation in the sense that people with access to computers, internet, television are the people who will respond because they are in that position. But people who are not, their responses may be very different. And it's only, we feel that research such as this has actually given a sense of it. We believe that there are many things that need to be done to deal with hate and hate speech. And but as I said, we're not sure that legislation is really part of the answer. Sorry, I just want to come back to one thing. I wanted to compare the speed thing. I apologize. I mean to deal with it earlier. But just to come back, because you mentioned the Masuku case, where the comments that were made on behalf of CASATU were, I think, generally considered anti-Semitic. But the interesting thing is, the comments were made 8 years before the matter was heard. 8 years before the matter was heard. And given the Jewish history, there's a sensitivity, but what's really scary is that, notwithstanding that the courts, other than the Supreme Court of Appeals, that the Human Rights Commission and the High Court found that he had expressed hate speech and anti-Semitism, all that the Jewish Board of Deputies was looking for was an apology. And he wouldn't give it. And CASATU wouldn't give it. And they didn't feel any pressure to give it. So all the legal processes, they asked nobody of them, just an apology. He's never given it. And it's now proceeding to the Constitutional Court, which is understandable, but as I say, it shouldn't have got that far, because I think the Jewish Board of Deputies generally has dealt quite well with incidents like this and how it's dealt with it, and very conciliatory at the end of it. Very much a dialogue, very much discussion, etc., and it's quite impressive. The law's done nothing. So, there I've put a spoke in the wheels of everybody and everything, and I'm sure you want to interrogate it.
I want to say a quick thank you to our speakers. I'm going to ask you all to please take a seat up front, and we will start our Q&A session. What I will do is I'll take a round of questions, and then we'll come back to the speakers and so on and so forth until we come to a conclusion. I will ask you to please be concise with your questions. If you have a comment, please find the speakers afterwards. There's going to be time for you to network. We want to keep it moving and make sure everybody has a chance to speak. Okay. So as a moderator, I'm going to take a bit of liberty and start. My first question is for Professor Nal. I know you didn't want to go into the your research's methodology, but I wanted to find out, because we don't know how to identify hate crimes specifically, how do you go about tracking the prevalence in order to come to your conclusion? That's my question for you. And then I wanted to speak to Ms. Khan about social media and just understanding that what we've seen is that our courts, though they should be independent and be perceived to be independent, social media definitely has an influence and could be perceived to suggest that certain cases are more important than others, and therefore that could contribute to the experience with which they go through the court process. So I think that, do you think that we should pay a bit more attention to, even if the percentage is small, of those of us who have access to social media, should we pay a bit more attention to what discourse takes place in that space, and maybe be more careful about how court processes go as a result? And those are my two questions, and I will open up questions to the floor. Chris?
I didn't quite track what the differences between hate crimes and hate speech, and maybe that's the whole topic. So I didn't quite track the difference between hate speech and hate crimes. Maybe you can unpack what it was, what it is, what it's going to be, because I didn't quite follow. Thanks.
Anybody else?
Thank you so much. I arrived a little bit late, but I think I've heard enough from Professor Nell and as well as Mrs. Jan. What I want to say is that we need to realize that the life in South Africa is based on a black and white mentality, which is a racist mentality. And unless we want to move forward from that, we really need to look at the race classifications like the BBB, triple BE, white monopoly capital, and all these type of situations are used specifically for political gain and for political control. When I look at the situation today, and I think maybe even the Center of Unity University need to really check, because from my point of view, from the Khoi and San, the so-called colored community, we are always excluded. 400 years of oppression has passed, we continue to be excluded. And until society address that injustices, we have no right to speak of justice. And when I look at what the last speaker shared concerning the people that she mentioned concerning race, I think what you might miss is that the influence that the statements has on the people outside, it's not that the white people, if I can put it in that, acted and said, yeah, this is right. No, where I followed it on media, they actually were speaking against it, and we could see that that was a change. However, it was the results that it brought concerning specifically onto the blacks, because the farm murders increased and the political leadership just ignored it. And whenever the other side of the coin, which I call the black and white coin, do exactly the same thing, no justice. And so until society in itself, specifically, and I'm going to use this, the black and white society, address the injustice of the past, we have no right to call for justice ourselves. And my question to the leader, the speaker, or the panelists will be, how do you suggest society address the injustices of the past so that we can walk forward with justice in the future?
Thank you. I'm going to come to the panelists and then revert to you. If you guys just keep an eye out on whose hand is up.
Shall I start?
Please.
So the question was around methodology and prevalence. What I indicated at the outset that this was not a prevalence study. So indeed, it would have entailed a very different methodology if we were to make claims around prevalence. So at most what I was saying is that if one looks at anecdotal evidence, media reports, and concerns raised by civil society organizations working with vulnerable sectors, then certainly we don't think that what we found in our study is far off the mark. But from what we did, we certainly don't want to generalize at all because we can't. It wasn't a prevalent study. If it were to be a prevalent study, we would have had to make sure that the opportunity of cases across the board being brought to the table would have been equal, and that wasn't the case. Indeed, we relied heavily on organizations who are members of the hate crimes working group and who participated in the research, so there was a skew already in terms of who brought cases to the fore. And it reflects to a great extent what the hate crimes working group strong pockets of representation would be, and it is around non-nationality, LGBTI organizations, and religious-based organizations. If I may, I'm just going to briefly introduce what I suppose Sarah is going to be responding to, because I think your second question was to Sarah. Social media or anti-social media?
Social media is a very tricky thing, because somebody said it should be the means by which we do meet each other and improve our race relations, etc., etc. But it's not structured like that, and as a result, it's largely, really, let's call it a medium for some very nasty behavior. And the reason is, sorry, I thought I did.
Sorry, I'm useless. Yeah, I can't.
Okay, I'll just speak louder.
Okay.
The reason is because I believe because of anonymity. Okay. It's because of the anonymity. Well, obviously Facebook not so much, but certainly Twitter. Even then, you can hide behind a moniker, and it emboldens people to say the most dreadful things. They can actually say what they think. You can't control what people think. You can try and influence what they think, but you can't control what they think. And the problem is social media allows you to hide. A lovely example, I mean, I became a prolific letter writer to Business Day at one point. And you always, and I think you do this with most papers, what you have to do is you have to provide your name, your address, and they have to be able to check where you're coming from. That you do exist, and you are who you say you are. You can say, please keep me anonymous, but it forced you to some extent moderate how you spoke, not necessarily what you spoke about. Social media is a free-for-all. You can say absolutely anything. Social media should not influence the courts. It's not to say judges are not going to hear and see what happens on social media. It's unavoidable, but they are specifically trained and tasked to look at what they have before them in terms of the rules that they have to follow. So if the social media is not part of the evidence, it's disregarded. If it is, it can be regarded, but it's all got to fall within the rules that pertain to how a judge is meant, magistrate is meant to make a decision. Where I think that social media and the media unintentionally play a role, and this is where you get the distinction between hate speech and hate crimes, is hate speech, I think, being aware of what people are saying gives the authorities and the criminal justice system an opportunity to track people. People who start to come up more than once, where they're coming from. In other words, looking at the possibility that their hate speech can become a hate crime. In other words, a killing or an assault or a series of assaults based on their hatred of a particular group. And I think that is, as far as the justice system, is where hate speech could play the best role. But you do need a functioning police force. With regard to the race classifications, being the Institute of Race Relations, we feel very strongly about this, and that is that it doesn't matter whether it's for good or alleged good or supposed good. As soon as you classify people, that's where the problems are going to start. And essentially what the BEE legislation, BBBEE, all relies on is a classification that was created under the Population Registration Act of the National Party. I mean, that probably had to be the linchpin of all that was bad about apartheid. And we believe there are a variety of ways of society and the government helping people who have suffered disadvantage to be given a leg up, and it doesn't have to, one doesn't have to use race to be the measure. There are a variety of other ways of measuring it. How do we address the injustices of the past? I think freedom of speech is a huge part of it. Because if speech is out there, people hear what your experiences are, whether you've been dealt with fairly or unfairly by society or by the government or by the law. And while a lot of hate can be expressed in social media, a whole lot of other things can be expressed as well. Perhaps let's give a little example. A couple of months ago, a young lady who stopped at a petrol station north of here, and the young man who filled her car, gave her 100 rand. Now the thing is about that, it was purely an act of kindness. There was no motive on either part, certainly not the way I read it. There wasn't motive on either part, and her response was gratitude. And I think that showed the absolute better part of our genuine humanity. And that if you sort of do what happened in the Penny Sparrow case, the people that you're trying to get to improve their attitudes become more hardachat, if I can put it that way.
Okay, Chris, maybe I can answer your question. Sorry? Oh. Okay, just answering your question about hate crimes and hate speech, and Chris, now just help me if I'm wrong here. So hate crimes, essentially, you have, for instance, your crime such as assault, okay, now it's driven by, the fact that you perhaps gay, also the crime is committed, so assault is committed due to a person having an anger. So those two elements are required, so and then it would be classified as hate crimes. In terms of hate crimes, or in terms of bill, hate speech will also be fall under hate crimes, but it specifically provides for an offence of hate speech. So your expression which propagates hatred due to basis of a prohibited ground such as sexual orientation, for instance, again. So it's a bit different. It's very different actually. But just understanding it's your ordinary crime. It's an ordinary a criminal offence. Being driven, murder, being driven due to a person's, for instance, a prohibited ground such as sexual orientation, and that will be classified as hate crimes. Am I correct? Yeah, we didn't spend so much time on hate crimes, but again, it would be because it's not, you do see it happening, and because it's not perceived, distinguished from ordinary crimes, it's explained it can't be properly prosecuted. So it'll perhaps now be taken if you make a case for it on sentencing. But that's always difficult. You need to show, and you need to properly build a case around it to say, well, it was actually that factor which drove the sentencing and should be drove a crime and should be an aggravating circumstance. And but it depends again on a judge you see. So there's definitely a need to distinguish it. I think that's the only question I can answer.
We can go back to the floor. There was the lady in the. Okay. I see you. Okay.
So this is, I guess, a general question for the panel, but particularly for Professor Now, they seem to be in favour of legislation against hate speech. And my question is, because you spoke sort of very, very vaguely about harms to communities, if the very notion of community is very vague. And so the question is, what would you do about those concerns where legislation is used to, in a sense, censor people and to limit academic freedom and freedom of expression? So, for example, in England, a big problem there is anyone who criticizes or even questions, in fact, questions about transgender are immediately labeled transphobic and targeted and harassed. And that shut down what I think is a very important debate about those sorts of issues. So the worry is that by having a kind of nanny state and legislating hate speech, you're really raising a serious danger about limitations of academic freedom and freedom of expression. And in fact, I'm at the University of Cape Town, and I think exactly that has happened. Obviously not in the legislative way, but in a very informal way.
Okay. Next to you.
Hello, my name's Swain. for a sec. Just a question, and perhaps asks for speculation. Given that the Constitution is the founding document, and given that it sets out very specific limitations on freedom of speech, it doesn't actually define it as hate speech, it just sets the limitation. Why do you think we have, from that point, steadily progressed towards, through the Equality Act now potentially, to hate speech being a crime? Because it would seem, in a very real sense, to be something which, if we are what we say we are, which is a fledgling democracy, surely to protect to the utmost what is probably the foundational aspect of any democracy, which is freedom of speech, and yet we're seeing a steady erosion of it. Why do you think that would be cause of speculation?
Thank you. Konrad?
Hi, thank you very much for your all insightful talks. I think I have more or less two questions, both more or less evolving around social media. First of all, I mean, as you, Professor Nell, said, hate speech or hate crimes are basically identity crimes. But in a time of social media and in a time of increasing globalization and hybridization, identities become increasingly fragmented. And there's also, this phenomenon also has very huge implications for leadership, because I actually believe that every individual seeks leadership, but the sources of leadership are very manifold nowadays. And there recently was an incident in Germany, actually not so long ago, well, I'm from Germany, not so long ago, where a man during the highest Jewish celebration tried to get into a synagogue with self-built weapons, trying to shoot around, and that was an act fostered by the internet, because radicalization takes place on the internet. He tried to imitate a deed that was taking place in New Zealand, in Christchurch, which we all probably heard of. And so my question, first of all, is how does the legal system respond to these kind of realities? Because speech actually results in acts, and in times of fragmentation and fragmented leadership, how does accountability is ensured by the legal system in the way of prevention, most probably? Because freedom should, in my opinion, stop where one person's freedom limits another person's freedom. And that's actually the transition to my second question. The whole question around where freedom should stop. Because I think that actually goes especially to you, Mrs. Gong, because you've had a very liberal opinion on these kind of things, but where are the borders of liberalism in this case?
Any more questions? Yes, lady in yellow.
Hi, I'm Kismea Nordela from a women's organization called Power. We've had some issues on social media where some of our women have spoken out or just questioned some of the comments that one of the EFF members in the Western Cape, he started belittling her by calling her fat and all these ugly words, and then it continued via inbox. We weren't sure how to handle that, so we reported it to the organization. They promised me that they would handle it and would get back to me. And recently, in the last month, that same person, there was a video on Facebook how he acted in front of his wife, and he was chasing somebody away from his home. And in that video, it was said that he had a protection order. She had a protection order against him. And the question is similar to lady over this side is how do we respond to that? And what legal recourse do we have? Thank you.
Okay, panel.
Given that my background is not in law, I'm not going to say much about it, but I'm just going to read a heading, so it's response to the last question. You could soon face jail time for sending these 3 type of Facebook or WhatsApp messages in South Africa, and of course it's the cybercrime and cybersecurity bill that I think has since been passed into law. I'm wanting to use that as introduction by possibly setting the record straight, and it's responding to the understanding that I'm in favor of legislation. I'm absolutely in favor of legislation against hate crime, no doubt, and for based on evidence in terms of how you can distinguish hate crime from other crimes, and indeed that the harm done by hate crime extends when the crime is not targeted at a specific identity. But I think what I've tried to bring across in my presentation is that when it comes to hate speech, I'm not in favor of the criminalization of hate speech. And it's a position of the Hate Crimes Working Group as well in general, that there should be civil remedies, and that indeed I'm a proponent of the Equality Act if it were to be amended and strengthened and those barriers being addressed, absolutely. And again, because in the interest of time, I'm not going to be able to fully give the argument, but I can share a related editorial that we published regarding the Kulani hate speech case, and of course the documents of what we submitted as evidence in that Kulani case is available in the public domain. So again, you can see the arguments that were made in that regard. I think the Equality Act has a very, very important role to play in our constitutional project. And if you think about a constitutional project that is actually in its infancy to a great extent, and it's as much as I think we've got fantastic laws and policies in a range of areas, we know how poorly we've implemented a range of those as well. So I'm not going to talk about how well we did with the constitutional project, because I think we failed in many respects. I do think we've overemphasized the role of the law, but as a psychologist, what I can say is I think the law has a very important symbolic meaning, and it does give certain indications of what is acceptable in a society and what not. So I'm not asking for the criminalization of hate speech, quite the contrary. I am asking that the Equality Act becomes easier accessible, and of course that the measure that is used to judge the merits of race-based hate speech versus homophobic hate speech versus xenophobic attacks would be standardized, and that we have a general understanding of how to use the courts in an appropriate kind of a way. But then I possibly just want to say as well, in my understanding of the both the Equality Act and then, for that matter, what's currently proposed for the Hate Crimes and Hate Speech Bill, is that academic freedom, creative expression, there's protections built into the framework for those aspects. Whether it's necessarily always well implemented is a different story. And then I'm going to end with a comment just around freedom should stop where, should be limited where it imposes somebody, limits somebody else's freedom. I fully agree with that, and it's in that regard that I do think that to simply say that in a democracy that freedom of expression should overrule everything else, I don't agree with that. From a psychological point of view, there's a massive body of work in terms of what racist attitudes do. We know how entrenched racist attitudes are in this country, and perhaps it's a comment on Sarah, just in terms of that when it comes to homophobia and the likes, that it's so embedded in our culture, yes, exactly for that reason, you need some guidance from the courts as to the fact that you as an individual, based on cultural, religious or other grounds, of course, you've got the right to think, believe whatever you want to. Do you have the right to express it in ways that are hurtful, harmful, and that might propagate hatred? I don't think so.
Okay, so I think I can answer the question regarding how does our law respond to these messages, Kismia. So, I mean, it's a fact our law can't keep up. So technology advances too quickly, and the problem is especially social media takedowns. I mean, and cyberbullying, per se. And it's a huge problem. I mean, you've had a cybersecurity bill, which I'm not quite sure if it has yet been passed. But I mean, it also provided for hate speech and takedown notices and etc. It's also been very controversial from the start. It's been also made at various times, so it's really looking better. There are still concerns. However, you know, your ordinary, you would have to go and get a protection order. It would be your first call to do. It is not adequate. It does not address this problem, and I think that's currently not just in our reality, but we need to step up. Our law needs to step up to find a solution on it. But possibly our law can't step up quickly enough, so you need to look at education. You need to identify quickly a problem in schools as well. We specifically see it at workplaces, and probably look for solutions different than the law, because the law won't in this instance. And we've actually spent a lot of time at cyberbullying conferences and hearing from school teachers to look out for what specifically alert the school, alert the parents to it. That's one aspect in a job, in a workplace as well. There are measures the employer can take, for instance, but our law, so it's not keeping up. Hopefully, you do get on social media platforms. I mean, there is, especially in Europe in general, there is very strict requirements on Facebook and Twitter and so on, all your social media platforms to immediately take off and for penalties and etc. We still slow. So, but we've got the Forms of Publication Amendment Act came into operation a few weeks ago, which also, you know, is a hate speech prohibition, and it's more in line with the Constitution, but there are concerns, and we'll need to see how it's implemented as well. So. Hope it's not a perfect answer, but we need to. It's an interesting time. I mean, it's an interesting time for attorneys as well, and specialising. You know, there will always be work. Specialising in social media, and it's actually become quite a big professional field nowadays. Specialised field, I mean. Michael, I don't know if I can answer. I think Sarah might be able to answer your question regarding, because I think it's more a political question of why. You know, we've got these international standards, specifically international law guidance, as I tried to emphasize, but our laws don't reflect it. So I think she can probably more speak to that.
Maybe that's good, but not so much. You know, other than to say that there are standards, but they're not per se enforceable, unless they're in your legislation. My concern with legislation, you know, the more legislation shuts down speech, is you end up. You can shut down speech without legislation. I've just come back from a trip to the States, not a working trip, just one. But you know, obviously, you're listening to the radio a lot and watching television, reading newspapers, and there is no doubt freedom of speech is being completely constricted, even though the Constitution, there's no legislation to affect freedom of speech at all. There's no limitation. But it depends how that legislation is worded and who is enforcing that legislation. Whether, and in the States of America, whether you have a Democratic Party Congress, or you have administration, or you have a Republican administration. So that would be affected, that would have one set of effects versus what happens in the social sphere. I mean, I've read a number of articles about it, and I think Eliza could talk to this better than I could, but the erosion of academic freedom and freedom of speech on campuses in America particularly on the expense of Ivy League things, is absolutely terrifying. I mean, it is absolutely terrifying. And that obviously that has nothing to do with the legislation, but it also suggests that, you know, unless you throw people in jail for 30 years for it, I don't think you're going to have a great deal of effect. Partly, one of the problems with legislation is you're dealing with an issue that is so widespread. In other words, social media is so huge, and so many people are on it, and so many people can express an opinion. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. Well, no, sorry, I got it wrong, because that's supposed to be you're supposed to be able to do it. But it's a shot down, a scatter approach. You don't know where to start, and the problem is your legislation may become ineffective because of that. That's not to say, and obviously being an opponent of legislation on the issue, what courts take into account in terms of aggravation and mitigation of sentencing, that is another thing altogether. And that is certainly something that, you know, judges can be trained, guidelines can be given to say that if the rationale behind a crime was hate of some kind, it aggravates the sentence or the penalty that will be suffered. We've been doing that for centuries, and it works. However, it only works if the case gets to court in the first place, and there we have a problem, both with the prosecution service and with the police. And the example of the protection order is perhaps the best example. The idea is great, but the enforcement is twofold. One is, how do you keep an eye on every protection order? And two is, you've got a lot of people, guys in the police, who are misogynistic, to say the least, and they just do not respond to a female victim, or certainly not adequately. That is about training, it's about societal anger, getting the message across, it's about having politicians who are forced to listen. But I agree with the point about freedom. Freedom is never unlimited. It's a sort of ideal that you aim for, but freedom is, I agree, limited to the extent that my freedom infringes on your freedom. And in reality, that is what law, that is what behavior, that is what lobbying is invariably going to reflect. Finally, I think one of the reasons why I'm not sure that specifically legislating hate crime is helpful enough, in the sense that if somebody attacks remember, an attack can be verbal or physical. It doesn't have to only be physical. The key is to what extent your justice system knows and understands that it has the power to penalize because it is a hate crime, and therefore it reflects the penalty. Sorry, yes.
I'm
sure I want to say more,
last,
but I couldn't remember what I wanted to say.
last round of questions. Gentleman here, gentleman in the corner.
Thank you very much. My question, I wanted to put it this way. We can see democracy gives us freedom of expression, which creates a room of hate speech, and that hate speech is not yet identified up to now. But my question is, in 10 years, if it's still not identified, and the victim of hate speech mostly is society, so what are we thinking about? How long society going to be patient by being a victim of hate speech? And does anyone have estimation? If there's no estimation, so what's going to be in 20 years the reaction of society regarding hate speech? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Steve. I want to ask a question about politicized hate speech, especially from politicians. Just when it comes to the elections or other, come to use politicized hate speech mostly to gain a lot of popularities, and sometimes they go above the law, and mostly they get away with it. And the other thing I want to ask, it's the politicized hate speech in social media, like the way social media is now. Can it be contained just in case it get out of control? Then, how can it be contained? Especially when it comes from, politicized hate speech. Thank you.
Over in the corner. Anybody else? No. Okay.
Regarding what was said by Ms. Khan, which I believe she expressed that the cases regarding Ms. Sparrow and Coxavalas were, in a way, a miscarriage of justice in saying that it was like an overreaction. But we still understand the fact that things can be said which are classified as hate speech do have effects. Should the government or legislation also have a role in combating things that are said that are not necessarily inciting violence or discrimination? Because how would this, because it is taken away from free speech, it could be seen as taken away from free speech, how would this also have to deal with things like fake news, which is something which is becoming more of an issue today, which isn't necessarily hate speech, but is false information which can lead to hate speech or can also come in the form of speech.
Thank you. Final question, and then we go back to the panel.
Thank you. I'm Ernest. I'm from the Rwandan community. The one thing I wanted to just ask is that at what point does one, what means do we have to say, look, we're going to report that this is hate speech? We've seen some politicians when xenophobia was happening, they kept on brushing it to say, look, we are not against foreign nationals, or we are against foreign nationals, but it took some time for people to accept that it was xenophobia, for instance. So you say a foreigner, but you do not want to accept that it is xenophobia because it's targeting a group of people. So at which point does, what are the means that we have as society to say, look, let's say for instance the Mashaba, the mayor of Johannesburg, he says he cannot apologize because because people sell counterfeits and all of those, but that does not give people the right to say, look, these people are selling counterfeits, therefore we're going to kill, we're going to do this and that. So what means do we have? Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask the panel to respond, and then after you respond, you can give us your closing comments, should you have any.
Okay, I think I specifically want to answer what means to be happy, because it actually concerns me that the public actually has asking these questions, because it shows to you actually the Human Rights Commission, who is tasked to your Chapter 9 institution, is tasked to investigate these matters, do not seem to be accessible. I mean, they should educate people and say, okay, this is how you actually can lay a complaint of, and help you to lay a complaint. I mean, they can even on their own accord investigate matters, and that's why it's so concerning. We need to actually question the effectiveness of the Human Rights Commission, considering its huge role it plays, and it has you can go into its capacity constraints. I mean, we've seen it's underfunded, and it has, there's just too few investigators. There are a lot of problems. But the fact is, why hasn't these matters, why didn't they investigate it on their own accord? And specifically, you would be able to go to the Human Rights Commission. Their websites should be, it is accessible, but again, I mean, from an academic point of view, I understand the process, but it should be more accessible for the public to know exactly, okay, this is how you lay a complaint, A, B, and C. This is how we report back to you. It's a procedure. They need to get back to you you lay a complaint, they need to get back to you, and if you're unhappy with a complaint, you can go to a court, you can take it on review. So, I mean, the public know too little about it, and that's highly concerning. You can also lay a complaint, in a criminal area, you can go to a police station and make a case for it. But again, this goes to, I think Sarah has spoken a lot about it, about effectiveness as well of your, you need institutions who are effective. You need actually a police officer who's going to sit down and help you regarding this charge. And because, so you say, well, this is my complaint, this is what I'm concerned about, but you are public, you don't necessarily know how to phrase it, to put it. So it goes again to, we've got these institutions, and I think it also relates to, sorry, is it a CR? Sorry, so your name is CR. Yeah, to your question that you asked about SAHRC, sorry. How society, what is the reaction of society? It's a holistic approach. I mean, we can't just expect legislation. I do think there's a need for legislation. Again, it has to be balanced, and it has to respond, but it should be in a means that I don't believe criminal sanctions are the way to go. But it goes back to education. It goes back to, it's so many stakeholders could be involved, and as in a society. So that reaction, you need a holistic response to tolerance. What we as a country definitely need, and we have got a specific history as well. We need to sit down and discuss it, and we need to be honest. We need to be. Those hurt needs to come out as well. But it concerns me very much that people know so little about how to actually lay a complaint in the Human Rights Commission, for instance, and they're specifically tasked to investigate it.
So I suppose mine would be a mixture of responding to some of the questions and closing comments, if that's okay. On the one hand, I do think the Constitutional Court's judgment that is due around the Masuku case, I suppose in the coming months, should give us some clarity around freedom of expression versus the limits of speech. I do think the Kwelani case is also going to end up in the Constitutional Courts, and perhaps that's good, as much as it's going to take more resources of our team. But the clarity that the country is seeking is important, and the fact that things are so blurred and confusing on so many levels, I don't think is helpful at all. But I suppose what I would like to highlight just in conclusion, as well as the comment around police attitudes, and specific in relation to women and misogyny. We can say the same around police attitudes towards LGBTI people. They're homophobic, they're transphobic. If we don't have clarity in the law, and whether it's then statutory or civil remedies around what is acceptable or not in our country, it's in accordance with that law and guidelines that, of course, resources are made available, including training of your criminal justice system and the likes. Prejudice being institutionalized in this country, given a very, very specific history, means that prejudice has to be tackled head on. It means that we have to have clarity and guidance to our society in terms of what a democratic, open, non-discriminatory and equal society would entail. And to what extent there's a distinction between you, the individual, and what you do in your own private life, what your own belief system is, and what indeed in the common good or in the communal space would apply. And so I suppose what is important in terms of hate and the psychology of hate is that we potentially have to work harder at undoing what has become a hierarchy of hate in our society. There shouldn't be a hierarchy of hate, whether it's xenophobia, whether it's racist-based, whether it's homo and transphobic, whether it's anti-Semitic, and I can continue with that list. Hate is hate, prejudice is prejudice, and we know from the body of psychology that where, as I've said earlier, where there's discrimination, where there's prejudice, and where there's victimization on the basis of those things, it has dire consequences physically and mentally for the victims. And it's at that level that I do think We need a response. It doesn't have to be a criminal response. It can be a civil response. And certainly, as much as the hate crimes working group didn't include much around restorative measures in our response to the hate crimes bill, I personally am very much in favour of restorative measures.
Sorry, I was thinking about. I actually wanted to just make a comment. The lady, unfortunately, is left, but she mentions schools. I sat on, my kids went to governing bodies, government schools, and I sat on governing bodies for 13 years. And when you on a governing body, in that context, you're responsible for the sort of discipline that could result in expulsion. So it's serious stuff. I think nowhere near enough attention has been given to education, and I mean education on the social issues. One of the problems, I believe, is that a lot of the crimes against women, and the same would apply to most other groups, has to do with, particularly with boys, has to do with how they're brought up, what they're brought up to believe. And the studies have shown, as far as I understand, the age you can't get them too young because they won't entirely know what you're dealing with, but sort of grade 8, grade 9, ages 13, 14, maybe 15, are the ages where training and education can shift attitudes. By the time you get to sort of grades 11, 12, it's probably too late. Age-wise, it's too late. And certainly young adulthood is way too late. And I think not enough has been looked at in terms of how kids are growing up, what attitudes they have. And I've seen it very distinctly in attitudes to women. I saw it with kids, either boys towards their mothers or towards female teachers, which obviously is a big issue because most of the teachers are female. And it's almost something there's a hole in the approach we take to these issues, and that is dealing with what are kids being brought up to believe, because it is about beliefs. And this is probably where I differ a little bit from the professor in regard to misogyny, LGBTQI issues, etc. When you train to be a policeman, you train to deal with crime and disturbance. I mean, police unfortunately tend to end up being social workers more than really policemen, and they cannot prevent a problem. They can only sort of mediate it and then charge. But it doesn't deal with the attitudes of the men who are dealing with those issues, and that should come from the top. I mean, the police, or the hierarchy, the managerial hierarchy, should be dealing with that issue and taking people to task, and that's not happening. And I suspect part of the reason is lack of capacity. It's just the police force is overwhelmed, and part of the problem may well be the attitudes of the senior management themselves. From a point of view of how does one deal with hate speech leading to hate crimes, and particularly how long do we have to deal with it, is I believe the word holistic has been used, and I think that's correct. It's about training, it's about education, it's about getting schools involved, parents involved, etc., etc. And it is about pressure. It's about trying to find ways, individually as groups, getting onto the media. I mean, have a look at, sorry, I forget the young lady's name, the UCT student who was raped and murdered. The students who started that movement, that really triggered a response. I mean, you could see immediately afterwards, anywhere in the country, whether it was Natal or Gauteng, people were being arrested for those sorts of crimes. And that's a pressure thing. That's politics, that's pressure, that's social, everything about it. It's not easy, it's not quick, and it's not necessarily tidy, but it's that. It's getting ahead of the law, in fact. You were talking about hate speech and xenophobia. I think we should charge politicians. I think it was the Minister of Small Business, I'm not quite sure, who proposed that certain areas of business that foreigners be excluded from. You know, I mean, hello? Either you're a democracy or you're not a democracy. So, and it's, I think, coming out against that. I mean, that's what we try and do. We spend our lives coming out and saying, we think this is wrong, we think this is wrong, we think this is wrong. Do people want to support us to say more of that this is wrong? So it's all part of a broader experience. The same would happen with a guy like Mashaba. It would be the same sort of issue. With regard to containing social media, I think one of the ways you deal with it is, here you can pass, well, I don't think you need to pass a law. I think the media, the houses, the groups that host social media, the Facebooks and and this I do think you can make a law. No one may register on a platform in a pseudonym. It must be in their name, and an address must be put forward to identify where they live before they can go onto the platform. And I promise you, the hate speech will reduce in number because people cannot hide behind their anonymity. And that's sort of the answer to whatever I've got to ask.
Okay, I want to say thank you to our panelists. Before I hand over to Christian to close, I just want to summarize what they've said. And I think that in terms of freedom of expression, what's important is clarity. If you name the thing, then you can address the thing. So we must find out what counts as xenophobia, as transphobia, etc. And I think that we are struggling with that in the form of the bill. That's why there's a back and forth. We want to know what can count as hate speech, what can count as hate crimes. And it might take a long time, but it's important that the conversation starts here. And finally, to go back to another thing that I think Christina mentioned is that, and it might sound a bit weird coming from a lawyer, but the legal solution is not the only one. We need to have society come together. We need to have a change of attitudes and minds, a coming together of cultures and religions to enable us to move forward. It's all good and well that we can sit here and legalize everything, but clearly it's not working. So I'm going to say thank you to the panelists and ask Christian to close.
Gosh, wow. I certainly feel very enriched. I hope all of you do as well. I think it's been eye-opening hearing a little bit about the architecture of our legal system around this space. It was very interesting hearing about, I think, the debate around legislating versus value-based responses to the way that we want our society to look. I like the idea that legislation can give a direction, maybe not legislation, constitutional norms can give language and perspective to where we want to go as a society, but thereafter it's about political leadership and values. And I wanted to promote again a liberal idea specifically, which is, I think it was very hard won in Germany, for example, which is, as soon as you identify somebody by their identity rather than as a person, you're in trouble. Yeah. Right? Whether you see them as a race, or whether you see them by their sexual identity, or whether you see them by whatever that identity is, I think as soon as you see them as a group rather than a person, you're in trouble. That's basically what it comes down to. And it's up to all of us to moderate ourselves as much as it is to step out into the public space and to moderate others. We can't control what we think. We can control what we say. And we can certainly stop people from advocating things that are against the values that we want to see in our society. So, I think what is there to do for us? So I think the one thing is to keep an eye on the various court cases that are happening. I think that's very interesting, so we know where things are heading. I think it's worth saying that we should engage with the new bill that's coming through Parliament. We have a right as the public to engage with the bill and to influence it, and to put pressure on, through our political representatives, on the Human Rights Commission and also on the Equality Court to amend their approach to being more suitable. And then finally, I would say, get off Twitter. I'm not on Twitter, so it's very easy for me to say. You spoke briefly about this idea of your name and address should be associated with the things that you say. There was an interesting article recently, and I don't even know where it was or who it was, but they were commenting on the fact that in the early stages of the internet, one of the ways that internet companies were given a competitive advantage was that they were absolved as platforms from the content that was in the platform. And that gave them an advantage over traditional media, because traditional media, if Business Day prints something about me, then I can take the Business Day to court. So Business Day makes very well sure that they don't get taken to court. Google, Twitter, Facebook, they're not concerned about this. And maybe that's a big oversight. And I found Kara's comment particularly interesting about this idea of the cross-national problem. So South Africa legislating Facebook is not really an option, as far as I can see. Right? So how do we deal with the fact that we are having to deal with imported norms from other countries as well? So anyway, get off Twitter, speak to your political representatives, HRC, the new bill coming through, and please eat the food outside because it's been paid for and we want to see it gone. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.